What is going on, guys? Jeff here, Mad Hatter's Reef. This is where I talk about everything reef tank related. So if you love some reef tanks like I do, make sure you hit that subscribe button and the bell so you can be notified every single time that I upload a video. Today we're going to be talking about calcium and alkalinity, and we're going to critique some older videos that I've put up here on YouTube many years ago. I think the first one that we're going to take a look at is about 5 years old. The second one is about 4, and we're going to kind of review some of the methodologies that I have used in the past as far as correcting calcium and alkalinity issues in your reef tank. And then we'll get into some of the products that I use today, as well as a little bit more of an idea of how I go about correcting calcium and alkalinity in my systems. And it's a little bit different here, you know, at the store level as it is the way that I would approach it as a hobbyist, but it's still applicable and hopefully helpful to some of you folks out there. Ben asked a question a lot as of late as far as how to go about dosing calcium and alkalinity, and it seems like it was worthy of making a video on the subject, even though that there are a few videos that I've put out over the years, and I'll put a bunch of links in the show notes so you guys can check those out if you want to dive a little bit deeper. We're only going to kind of brush over these videos because one of them is a little bit long in the tooth. We'll spend a little bit more time on that one. First one being kind of the first time I kind of dipped my toe in the subject. I thought I was going to do a lot more critiquing here with you guys. I kind of looked over them briefly before we jumped into this. And I wasn't too far off the mark. I thought it would be a lot of critiquing going on. But without further ado, let's jump into the first video. This one's about 5 years old. As you can see, the beard is much browner. Not completely brown. It's a little frosted. A little bit frosted. And for some reason, the shape of my head has changed a little bit. But without further ado, let's jump into this. You don't see very often, but it's definitely something that needs to be talked about. Calcium and alkalinity in a reef tank. Ideal parameters for calcium and alkalinity is anywhere from 390 parts per million up to 460 parts per million. A little on the high side, 460. Probably wouldn't consider 390 ballpark. Nowadays, it's narrowed for me as far as the measurement of parameters as far as calcium goes. I like it to be between 420 and 460. That's kind of the sweet spot for me. Ideal alkalinity for a reef tank is anywhere from 8 DKH all the way up to 11. There is a balance that needs to happen. A little bit more on the alkalinity. Definitely 8 is the starting point for me, and I usually like to keep it between 8 and 9, depending on what the system has in it for corals. But your genuine mixed reef tank, I'm shooting for about 8.5, which again has tightened up a little bit for me over the years. Not just between calcium and alkalinity, but within a reef tank. And one of the most important things that I could ever tell you about keeping a reef tank is consistency. Consistency is going to be the key to success when it comes to reef tanks. So over the last couple of weeks, I've been testing my parameters pretty often. Basically, I've made it a habit to test my parameters every time that I'm uploading a video on YouTube, which is Sunday. And I have noticed over the last couple of weeks that my parameters and my calcium have started to increase and the alkalinity start to drop. Now, for me personally, I like to keep my alkalinity around 8.5. And then my calcium, I prefer to keep that towards the top of the scale in that 450, 460 range. With all the corals I've been adding to the tank, I've started to notice a imbalance in between the calcium and alkalinity. And what I'm gonna do is kind of go over with you guys how I'm going to fix this problem. Currently, I just got done testing my parameters, and my calcium is at 490, which is almost off the scale as far as the Saltwater test kit goes. So at this point in time, I was pretty bought into Saltwater test kits. I have kind of moved over to HANA testing. I will use the handheld color meters. One unit that I'm actually really interested in taking a look at is the Master. And there's a lot of technology that's built into that, especially doing aquarium service. here offering that at the store. There's a lot of things that are built into that I like a lot. I have had issues with Saltwater calcium test kits not being accurate, and even though that they use a okay amount of test water, the amount of water that it uses to determine its results, I've even know that the Hannah uses far less. Over an extended period of time of doing ICP testing and then logging my Hannah test results, I have found that the Hannah is pretty spot on. That's why I've gravitated towards that. I mentioned that the calcium is in the 490s, which when you get past that 480 mark and you're creeping into that 500 parts per million area, that's a pretty dangerous place to be. You actually can have slow tissue necrosis start to happen in your corals, which obviously is not a place where you want to be, especially if you're investing a lot of money into corals. So I'll get into it in a little bit more detail in this video, my plan as to correct that. But I knew what I needed to do, but I didn't really understand what was happening from a chemistry standpoint, which has since changed over the years, but we'll get into it in a little bit more detail here.
And my DKH in my tank is running at about 7.5. So both of these parameters are way out of where they should be. And what happens often in a reef tank is when that alkalinity starts to drop, it actually can make that calcium skyrocket in the system. Now,
very proud of myself because that is 100% accurate. I have noticed on a lot of systems when that alkalinity starts to drop off, it almost ramps up the calcium to a degree. And obviously, calcium and alkalinity, they're not good bed mates. They fight all the time. And when that alkalinity starts to drop off, obviously that calcium is going to get a little bit higher. And that's a problem, especially once you're creeping into that 500 parts per million zone, which you do not want to be in.
Now, how I'm going to go about fixing this is very slowly, because you don't want to cause a influx of pH. You don't want to cause an influx in alkalinity. Anytime that you're trying to buffer your alkalinity, you want to make sure that you're doing it very, very slowly. So what better way to go about this than do it with my Neptune Systems dose and over the course of the week. So what we're going to do is jump into my Apex dashboard and make some adjustments with my dose and how I am adding the two-part elements to my tank, and then hopefully make an adjustment to the tank and make the levels kind of balance out a little bit.
All right, so we are in my Apex Fusion dashboard, and what we're going to be doing here is we're going to take my calcium and alkalinity dosing. I'm going to just essentially shut off the calcium doser. And typically how I dose calcium and alkalinity is I dose calcium during the day and alkalinity at night, but I'm going to be changing that also to just completely dosing a small amount of alkalinity over the course of a day. So basically what I'm going to be doing here is jumping into the dose pump that is responsible for putting the alkalinity into my reef tank. And how I currently have it set up is to dose a little bit after the lights go out to midnight, and then from midnight to 6 a.m. But I'm going to change that schedule from midnight all the way to midnight, essentially. And one of the great things about Neptune Systems Apex, especially when it comes to dosing, is that they figure it out all for you. Basically, you just set the time frame that you want it to dose and the amount that you want it to dose over that time. Neptune Systems Apex will do the math and figure out how often it needs to actually dose to meet the requirement of what you're asking for. So once you have the amount and the schedule set up, you can go back into the gearbox and then select interval summary, and it's going to break it down for you. It's going to tell you how much you're trying to dose over a 24-hour period or whatever time, how often it's going to dose. So every 17 minutes, it's going to put 0.4 milliliters into the reef tank. Now that I have my alkalinity set up the way that I want it, I'm going to go in and shut off the calcium altogether. Now, every single day for the next week, I'm going to be testing my calcium and alkalinity, keeping an eye on things. If I need to make additional adjustments, I'm going to do so.
So in there, you're seeing that I'm dosing 25 mils over a 24-hour period, which for a 220-gallon aquarium, that's a pretty cautious way to increase your alkalinity if you're going to even increase it at all. I think if I remember correctly, it took me about 7 days to get my alkalinity. I think it was 7.5 or a little bit lower, all the way up to 8.5. And that is very modest. You could, and I don't want people to take this the wrong way, but you could definitely dose a alkalinity product and do a 1 DKH correction within a 24-hour period. You want to make sure that you're doing the math on it, and we'll get into how I do math on the amount that I need to dose a little bit further in this video. But ultimately, I could definitely have corrected that alkalinity that day, brought it up from this 7.5, I think it was, to the 8.5 in that 24-hour period, and then figure out what I needed to do from there to maintain that level of 8.5. But really, outside of that, I think I did the right thing as far as taking it slow, because ultimately it took a little while for the tank to get there. You definitely want to take your time getting it corrected. And I tend to, even to this day, be a little bit cautious when it comes to my corrections. But ultimately, I think I could have done it a little bit faster than I did here, which 25 mils is probably more of maintaining than it is, especially with a 220-gallon tank. It was a 220-gallon display, which I think the sump, I still have the sump, was probably another 50 plus gallons there. So you're almost in the 300-gallon total water capacity at that standpoint. Obviously, there's displacement from rock and sand, but I probably could have been a little bit more aggressive than I was here in this video.
So I have my alkalinity back to where I want it, and my calcium has started to drop, and both those parameters are within acceptable ranges. I'm going to go back to my old scheduling of 2-part dosing.
So if you guys want to stay
Old scheduling, probably, I hope anyways, I don't really recall, old scheduling, hopefully to make up for the fact that I was not where I wanted to be, but figure out the correct dosage on a daily standpoint to maintain the level of DKH that I want to ultimately. I think what I meant to say there was going back to once the lights kick off and having it dose from there to midnight, and then from midnight on the other, because you can't pass the midnight, computers don't let you do that, from midnight till whatever time in the morning. The reason that I didn't get into it in a whole lot of detail, the reason that I was dosing alkalinity at night, even though that your consumption of alkalinity happens during the day, was to buffer the pH. Not all alkalinity products are going to have an impact on pH. Do your own research. Make sure you figure out how your buffer is going to impact your tank. But I was doing that to balance out my swings, because if you go back, let's see if I can do this without completely messing everything up. You go back here, you can see my pH on the tank was at peak on the graph, a little bit towards the left there. My peak was 8.18, which is decent, but it was dropping down to 8.08, and that was with dosing an alkalinity product that is going to have an impact on pH. So even with that, when the lights kick out, your tank goes into respiration. When the lights are on, your tank's making oxygen because there's algae growing in the system. And that's really the reason that I dose alkalinity at night, is to make sure that that is happening. We're not having huge swings with the pH. But even still, like, not even, I think at the time I really wasn't paying attention to pH. I really didn't care about it. Now that I'm a little bit more into aquaculture and growing of corals, I tend to pay a little bit more attention to pH, but I wouldn't recommend folks, other than just dosing alkalinity products at night, if you are using a doser, I wouldn't chase pH too much. But it is an indication of how the tank is operating and other things. There's some more stories that we could go into with pH, but that's probably a video for another time. All right, let's see if Well, we'll wrap that up there. We kind of got the gist of what that video was talking about. Again, if you wanted to dive into that video in a little bit more detail, we'll put a link in the show notes for that one. But let's jump into the next video where I started to get a little bit more primitive with the way in which I was dosing my calcium and alkalinity. And I really, in this situation, you know, I had high alk, so I wasn't really dosing any alkalinity. I had high calcium, so I wasn't dosing any calcium in the system. I stopped dosing and started increasing my dosage of alkalinity to hopefully kind of balance things out. And then once I needed to resume calcium and alkalinity dosing, once things had straightened out, basically, you know, went back into normal dosing regime. But let's take a look at this other video where we're looking at an entirely different system and a little bit different methodology of testing calcium and alkalinity. So today's subject matter, we're going to be talking about testing calcium and alkalinity, and we're also going to be talking about dosing by hand. Yes, we're old-fashioned here at Mad Hatter's Reef, dosing by hand calcium and alkalinity in the water box. Now it seems as we evolved as reef keeping hobbyists and as technology continues to bring this hobby further and further down the road, it seems like we're more often than not going towards the automated road, which there's nothing wrong with that. And I would love to get my hands on a Trident and be able to test calcium and magnesium and alkalinity multiple times a day and have that be able to communicate to the dose and have just this system of constant monitoring and constant adjustments being made on the tank to keep those parameters exactly where they need to be. But there's a lot of money associated with these new devices, and to be completely honest with you, I'd rather spend the money on corals. So today what we're going to be doing is taking a look at the levels for calcium and alkalinity in the tank, because just recently I've added a lot of corals to the tank, and my concern with that was, what is that going to do with my parameters? Are my parameters going to be even remotely in check? And with all the corals that I've added to the tank, I wouldn't be surprised if the levels for the tank are completely out of whack. But I could just sit here and continue to speculate, or I could bust out the test kits and know, because that's... It's interesting because, like, at this point in time, I started to sell corals. But I did not have any type of frag system, I think, at this point in time. So I was actually using the water box as like a holding tank, and I was going to shows and started to do the frag swaps and all that. Ultimately, and I kind of had forgotten about this, but like this was like the beginning of learning of what it is like to maintain a coral system at a fish store, which can be a bit crazy because you have corals that are coming in, you have corals that are leaving, and things are constantly changing. The consumption of the tank changes almost daily. So I wasn't quite at the point. I was still kind of doing the hobbyist thing where I was testing once a week, considering that unless there was some type of big correction that I was trying to do, just testing once a week and finding that, you know, things weren't working out the way that I wanted them to. But now, having owned a store, we're in year 4 now, having lived that life, you almost, like, to maintain a proper calcium and alkalinity level at the store level, you almost have to test daily. And, you know, if your corals are hanging out and you're not moving them that fast, which not every coral that you buy, you know, goes out that week, if it's not selling, it should be growing. And if you're not maintaining that calcium and alkalinity, it's definitely not going to be happy and ultimately can cause even bigger issues. But it's interesting to see the beginning of that kind of thought process happening in this system. That tank, I think it's like mid 40s as far as water volume. But I used to pack that thing full of coral prior to a frag swap. But yeah, it's interesting to see that thought process starting to develop. And I think this was only a year later from the 220 gallon. I'm not sure if I had the 220 gallon at this point. I might have shut it down because I had lost a lot of acro colonies in that system due to rapid tissue necrosis, which was brought on by a little clown goby that was killing off my acros. and got a little frustrated with that system, and I think it sat dry for a little while, but I'm not sure if it was running during this time. Difference between a successful tank and a tank that's most likely going to fail. So that's what we're going to do in today's episode. We're going to test and then figure out what do I need to do to make sure that the parameters are where they need to be. So let's jump into it. What's going on, guys? So today what I wanted to do for a video, wanted to talk about a couple things and more specifically get into hand dosing. Now, anytime that you're dosing anything into your reef tank, it's very important to make sure that you're testing for those parameters. You don't ever want to add anything outside of regular, good old-fashioned salt water to your aquarium without testing first, during, and after. And the reason that this is so important is because ultimately this is a vessel in which you put a lot of money into, and to just be adding stuff to it and not knowing what is going on once you're adding it is playing with fire, and eventually you'll get burned. So in today's video, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be testing for calcium, and we're also going to be testing for alkalinity. Now, as of late, I've been adding a fair amount of corals to the tank, and I haven't documented that yet for a reason, which we'll get into in a future video. But with adding a large amount of corals to the water box, it's very important to make sure that the parameters such as alkalinity and calcium and others are staying in check. But for today's video, we're going to take a look at alkalinity and calcium. So something else that's really important when it comes to dosing parameters, or at least hand dosing, is little graduated cylinders such as this one. I picked up this whole kit. I have a number of them. I have a 25 milliliter, a 50 milliliter, and a 100 milliliter graduated cylinder. I picked them up. They're glass, which glass is fragile, but they clean up a little bit better. They look a little bit better long term. And I got these on Amazon for relatively cheap, and I'll put a link down in the description below if you guys want to pick these up. Also, I still have these. They're here at the store, and I still use them to this day, which was 4 years ago. So they've held up pretty good. So a lot of the stuff that we're going to be talking about in today's video is calcium sulfur test kit and the alkalinity sulfur test kit. There will be links down in the description if you guys want to pick some of those up and test your parameters in your reef tank. Something else too, I'm assuming that there is something off in the tank. I can kind of tell things aren't where they should be as far as parameters, so if we need to make any adjustments, I also have these alkalinity and calcium supplements that I'm going to be using to bring things back to where they need to be. So we'll get into this in a little bit further into this talk, but I also still use those products as well. I don't do with the ME Coral calcium and alkalinity. It's a pharmaceutical grade product. I do mix my own at this point. I buy the powders and mix them. But also there's still a lot of value, and I guess depending on where you're at in the reefing, especially when it comes to dosing, the whole hobby of it, there is a place or something to be said about using a product that is already made for you, and it's consistent, and you can dose your system with it. It's also, you can save yourself a little bit of money by buying the powders if you are comfortable mixing your own products. But it's good to see that that I was using those products all the way back then. Obviously, the sulfur, alkalinity, and calcium test kits, I still have them around. I don't use them nearly as much as I do the Hannah products at this point in time, but we've already kind of touched on that. But I was still very, very bought into the sulfur test kits ultimately. So we're going to start off with the calcium test kit first. I've done this a number of times, and I'll say the same thing that I've always said. As far as doing this by memory, I don't have the best memory. I've had a lot of head injuries in my life, and that has used up all of my... That hasn't changed, by the way. I think I've gotten a couple cents. My storage capacity. So as far as testing these, I will have to look up the directions.
I'm not Billy Pipes by any stretch of the means. I just don't remember.
Oh, Billy Pipes. I wonder if he's still making videos. I haven't seen him in a minute.
And it's funny because I do this every single week, yet I still can't remember how to do it. I think it's a scoop of the powder, then 8 drops of CA, and then I think you just use a syringe to add CA3 until it changes color. I've also lost my chart or the directions with the calcium, so I usually have to jump over to a website. My auto top off just kicked on. I usually have to jump over to a website and read over it and check my results and all that stuff. So I'm going to go grab my iPad. So in the event that you ever lose your instructions, Marine Depot actually has uploaded the instructions as well as the results for your test on their website. So if you ever need to check it out, check out.
Rest in peace, Marine Depot. I think saltwateraquarium.com has since put the instructions to the Saltwater test kits on their website. BRS may have done it as well. I think any store, online store, it's a good idea for them to put the instructions up there just to help people out. Somebody like me, at this point in time, it's interesting now. I don't think I have any more room for capacity, but I do know how to test the Hannas without looking at the instructions. So it's interesting. I don't think my brain is healed, but just the same, I think that those instructions are available on those websites.
Marine Depot, they went above and beyond with retyping everything and adding it to their sales page for the test kit. So that's always helpful because I've lost both the instructions for the alkalinity and the calcium. Don't have a whole lot of battery life left on the iPad, but let's go through. So we need to take the 2mm syringe and grab some water. And something that I usually try to do is make sure that there is no air bubbles whatsoever in the syringe, just to make sure that my reading is going to be accurate as possible. So we got our 2mm. All right, so the next step is to add 1 spoonful of CA1. Don't stir it yet. Then 8 drops. Look at me go. I was doing pretty good, actually, so that's good. Because the memory bank is shot. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. All right, swirl. 10 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Alright. So with the calcium test kit, now what we're going to do is we're going to fill up the syringe with the plastic tip with CA3. I usually like to give this a little bit of a swirl before putting it in the syringe just to make sure everything is mixed up good. And we're going to pull out 1mm of fluid. We're going to push that plunger to 1mm. And it's okay that there's an air bubble in there. That is expected. At this point, we're going to add, I usually do 2 drops at a time with the syringe to what we have here. And whatever the results are, we'll be able to read it on the syringe. To good measure, and we're at the end point, so we're at blue. Kind of looks purple on the camera. That's what you're after with this test kit, is making it go from pink or orange to blue. So now we take our plunger here and we do a quick little reading. As far as what I'm going to call this, I'm going to call it 0.24, which when we go to our readout here on marinedepot.com, so 0.24 is 380 parts per million, which is within the range of what we want our calcium at. which is a good thing. So we're on the lower end for a saltwater aquarium. So your typical range for saltwater is going to be anywhere from 380 to 420 parts per million, and we just made the cut with a 380 parts per million in the water box. So we're in good shape there as far as the calcium goes. I probably wouldn't worry about adding any calcium at this point in time, but I am going to keep a close eye on it because I have added a large amount of coral to the tank, so it's going to be good to make sure that I'm testing the same time throughout. When I say the same time of the day. You don't want to test, like, you don't want to compare notes from 6 p.m. to 8 a.m. because there might be some different things going on in the tank that has impact on alkalinity and calcium and all those things. So it's good to make sure that you're testing at the same time a day every.
That's not 100% necessary for calcium. Calcium's not going to change as the lighting schedule happens. It's still a good practice to do it about the same time of day, but that's more applicable to alkalinity. Alkalinity is going to be at its lowest because the tank has been in respiration just before the lights kick on. And once the lights kick on, goes into oxygen production mode, and then that will increase the levels of oxygen that are in the system, which will rise the pH, and alkalinity follows pH. So that's why it's important to test at the same time of day. I will, in a circumstance where I am here at the shop and I'm testing alkalinity, I usually try to do it at about 9 a.m. If I am not here for whatever reason, I don't test that day, and I'll kick it off to the next day because there isn't much value in, like testing it at 2 p.m. and seeing where the alkalinity is at, because I'm not getting my baseline. And if I was comparing that to 9 a.m. the day before, those numbers are going to obviously be off. So very important with alkalinity testing the same time of day. Calcium, not so much. But let's see if I can even get into the alkalinity here. But I also 380 to 420. I like to be on the higher end of that nowadays, and being in that 420 range for your calcium as far as that level goes. If the corals are in a position where they want calcium, they want to start using it, I want it to be available to them. That's ultimately why I've kind of changed my mindset over the years with that.
Every single time that you test. Once a week is going to be enough. That's going to suffice in most cases. But if you're a little bit worried, like I am currently, it wouldn't hurt to test, 2 times a week, really. All right, so we're going to go ahead and pick this up. What we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead, and I think I may have left this vial, but this, yeah, it's gone. All right, so I'm going to have to track down the vial for the alkalinity test kit, and I'll be right back. All right, so I found my vial. Last time I used it, I left it in the bathroom, cleaning it out after I was done my test. So first thing that we're going to do here is we're going to pull some water out of the tank, and that was a really bad pull. So usually what works is I'll take the syringe, I'll put it in the water, pull it once, and usually it'll have a good amount of air in there. Then I'll place it back into the water, push it out underneath the water, and then pull it again, and that usually eliminates any amount of air that is in your syringe. So that's perfect. We're at the 4 millimeters, which is what the alkalinity test kit requires. Then we're going to take our KH indicator, and we're going to put 2 drops in 4 millimeters of water. 1, 2. Give that a little bit of a swirl. Now we're going to take our KH, and just like we did with the CA3, we're going to put our syringe in there, pull our syringe all the way back, and push it forward to the 1 milliliter line, and that air bubble, you can barely see it, it's right there. That air bubble is supposed to be there. That is figured into the calculation, so you don't have to worry about that. Alright, so I'm going to try to do a better job of swirling and adding this stuff at the same time. I'd say one more drop. We are at, yep, there it is. All right. So, substantially different here. So let's see what we're at for a reading. I'm a little worried. All right, so we are at, I'm going to say that's 4.8. So we're at 4.8, 8.3. Not awful, not great either. You know, your typical alkalinity window for a reef tank is anywhere from 8 to 12 DKH, and again, much like the calcium, we're kind of just knocking at the door. So I am going to add a little bit of alkalinity to the tank. I've been testing about the same time a day. You know, it's
So with this situation right here, I actually don't agree with myself what I did here. I wouldn't have been worried about the alkalinity at all, and I would have been dosing for the calcium. Granted, once you start putting calcium into the system, that alkalinity is going to drive down a little bit, so you'll have to do a balancing act between the two. So like if you're in a situation like this, you know, you might go to your local fish store and be like, hey, I got low calcium and my alkalinity is perfect. Do you have a calcium product? And they're like, yeah, take a look at this. And you buy that and bring it home. You're better off to buy both the calcium and the alkalinity at the same time, because there's a really good chance that once you start raising that calcium level in the system to 420, let's just call it that, and you are going to essentially be driving down that alkalinity in that same time. So not a week later, once you have corrected that calcium issue, you're going to have an alkalinity issue. So you might as well just buy both at the same time. So once that starts happening and you find the nuances and you're figuring out what your daily consumption is between the two, you'll have what you need. So that would be my recommendation. And in this circumstance, I shouldn't have messed with the alkalinity, because all I'm going to be doing is driving that calcium down even lower. I left the calcium the way it is, so that's probably the critique that I'd give myself in this situation. But let's see how I wrap this one up.
Perfect. I'm not a trident by any means, but I try to do it first thing Saturday mornings when I get up, have my coffee. I try to make a routine out of getting to the tank and testing it on a weekly basis. I log my results, so I use the Reef Trace app, and that's pretty helpful. That also has some information for you in there that is going to help give you the instructions that you need for the Saltwater test kit and a few others in there. I think Mark Levingston from Me Loves Reef has done a lot of work for that. So what we're going to do now is we're actually going to find a reef calculator, and we're going to utilize that. Then we're going to take one of these graduated cylinders and a little bit of ME coral alkalinity, and we're going to add it to the tank. And I'm going to show you guys how I go about hand dosing a reef tank. So let's jump over to the computer, take a look at what we need to add in millimeters to our system to get it to my ideal spot, which I'm going to call my ideal spot right now 9.1.
Right, guys, so we are over at Bulk Reef Supply, and we're going to use their BRS Aquarium and Reef calculator. Now, this is probably one of the best calculators out there, and essentially all you need to do is it's a drop-down menu, and it does the calculation for you. So we're going to be testing or dosing alkalinity, so we select alkalinity, and then we're going to be using a liquid soda ash product. And then as far as the type of product, doesn't really matter. We're just going to go with the jug at that point. The next step is to calculate your total water volume. Now, this system has a total water volume of 69 gallons. So when you think about live rock, when you think about sand and equipment, you're going to do a little bit of displacement. And I'm going to go on the heavier side of displacement, so it's going to minimize what I need. So let's go with 62 gallons, so about 5 gallons of displacement. Then we're going to add our current alkalinity level. So when we did our testing, which it's important to test anytime that you're dosing, we've already covered that, we tested at
8.2 DKH, and we want to raise it to 9.10 DKH. Hit the calculate button. There's going to be some instructions on how to go about adding the product and mixing the product. And essentially, right there at the top, we have our milliliters that we need to add to get the water box to the 9.1 DKH. Now, this is an adjustment that is less than 1 DKH, so it's something that I feel okay about adding in one shot. So now that we have this information, let's go back to the reef tank and dose alkalinity to the point where we are at a DKH that we want to be at. So before we get into that, I actually still use the BRS calculator to this day. It has changed. It doesn't look quite like that. It's a little fancier than it used to be. And in that circumstance, you know, I'm talking about adding that, 30 whatever mils to correct that 1 DKH in a 24-hour period, which I still kind of adhere to that as well. But I have since gotten a little bit more cautious with that, and I have actually started dosing a little bit less than what that 1% of whatever, the recommendation is. So what I typically will do, let's say just for, easy math, let's say your correction, whatever the case may be, is 100 mils of a alkalinity product. And even though, let's say in that circumstance, maybe it's not a 1 DKH bump, maybe it's a 2 DKH bump, I will take that 100 mils, that recommended dosage for correction, and break it up over 3 to 4 days. So I'll divide it by 3, or I'll divide it by 4, depending on how slow I want to take it. Obviously, being a little bit more cautious, if you divide it by 4, that's going to be a slower correction. And it's going to be important to see how your alkalinity reacts to that. So let's say you want to take a little bit more of the cautious route. You need 100 mils for correction, 25 mils per day. So let's say you do the dosing at night. I'm doing it during the day here. But the big thing really with all of that, there's a lot of different opinions out on the internet as far as that goes. But whether you're doing it day or night, I would do that 25 mil dose, and then the next morning before the lights kick on, especially with alkalinity, test and see how that 25 mil dose reacted to your tank. There can be some, miscalculations that can happen based off from using somebody else's calculator, especially if your product is a little bit different. Like I used a liquid soda ash product. If you pick one of the other options and you don't have that, your calculation may be wrong. So dividing that dosage by 4 and then seeing how that dose that you did plays out in your tank is going to be incredibly important to make sure that you're not making too much of an issue, with your system. Because you don't want to end up in a situation where your alkalinity is 15 or 16 DKH, because you're going to have some issues that arise from that. Obviously, your calcium will probably tank out. You might see, some burning of the tips of your acros. There's a lot of different things that can happen with that. So slow and steady wins the race, making sure that you're breaking up that dosage over a couple days, and then figuring out from there your maintenance to maintain whatever the level of DKH that you're trying to do. As you can see between these two videos, my methodology has already evolved over time. And I think, the conversation of folks, especially when it comes to what is being shared on the internet, there's so much misinformation. I can understand where somebody that is new getting into the hobby can be kind of frustrated and felt misled by even somebody like me who has been creating content for, I don't know how many years now, 15 years, and because your methodology changes over time, and there's nothing wrong with that, and you get better. We all get better over time, hopefully, anyways. And ultimately, what I've done in these 2 previous videos, and there's other videos on the channel as well, my methodology has evolved to suit what I'm doing currently. And I think I'm a lot better at handling your calcium and alkalinity. I understand it a little bit more. I may not be, a chemist, a reef chemist by any stretch of the imagination. But ultimately, from logging my information, observing what's happening in my tank, testing and getting better at testing has definitely helped me out tremendously, ultimately in becoming a better reef keeper. And I hope, some of that information in what we've done in this video, which we'll get into some of the products that I'm using currently, is helpful for somebody out there that's learning and trying to figure this whole thing out. The calculations that we put into the bulk reef supply calculator, we're going to be raising the DKH by 1, and that's probably the max that I am comfortable with as far as making adjustments to the alkalinity in a reef tank in a single serving. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to take our ME Coral alkalinity liquid, and we're going to pour, we're going to go with 35 millimeters. We're not going to do the full 39 for this dosage. We're going to keep it a little under. So I slightly over just a little bit, so we're going to make an adjustment there. All right, so we're at 35 millimeters of alkalinity. Now, when adding this stuff to a reef tank, most definitely want to put it in a place that's going to be high flow. If you do not put it in a high flow spot and you just dump it in there, it's almost going to turn into, it's going to look like super glue. Actually, it will dissolve a little bit if you start shaking it up. It's very important to make sure that you're adding your liquid alkalinity to a high flow section of your sump. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, this protein skimmer, I don't want that on. We're going to shut that off for the time being, just because I don't want to, where I'm going to be adding that alkalinity to the system, it potentially could just get skimmed out. So we're going to turn the skimmer off for a little bit. With that, what I just did there's a couple things I want to touch on that really don't fall within this subject, but I currently have my protein skimmer and my auto top off on the same power brick or power switch. So when I turn off that switch, if I'm doing maintenance to my protein skimmer, if the water level, which this protein skimmer really isn't big enough to cause a problem, but if it was bigger, it potentially could. But that water level will increase in the return section of the sump and potentially set off the alarm that is connected to this auto top off. So having them on the same power strip, I have the ability to shut both of them down at the same time. It's a good little side quest tip there. Downside to having these attached to a power strip is I need to remember to turn it back on. It's very important to make sure that you turn it back on. You don't want it off for a complete 24-hour period because, well, I guess depending on what type of corals you keep, it may be more damaging than not. But it's very important to make sure that within a couple hours of dosing anything, it's okay to turn that skimmer back on. I would probably wait, at the most with something like a bacteria dose, I'd wait like a 6-hour period before turning it back on, and that's not going to hurt anything. So not really within the scope of this subject, but something I wanted to touch on because it just happened. Back to dosing our alkalinity solution. So as far as the sump goes, I don't really want to add it to the display. I don't think that that's a good call. I don't really like the idea. I know I've seen tons of videos where people do it, but for me personally, I'd rather have this solution have the time that it needs to kind of mix in a little bit, so you're not just dumping, alkalinity right onto a coral, because I can only imagine that's going to cause problems. So as far as the way in which this sump is set up, I don't really have any high flow sections with the exception of where the water comes into that first baffle. And as you guys can see, I put in those sponges that I was talking about to keep that salt creep down off the back wall as well as off my wires. And I do have like a little bit of a gap between this sponge and the wall, and it's a good little pouring spot for hand dosing things like calcium and alkalinity. And then it gets mixed very vigorously in that section, comes into the skimmer section, then goes into the return. So it has a good little amount of time before it actually being introduced into the display tank. So what I usually like to do with alkalinity when I'm adding it is to add it
very, very slowly. I'm probably even a little obnoxious about how slow I go about adding it. And I literally do a little drop like that, let the cloud that is formed immediately kind of dissipate a little bit, and then slowly add some more. In the past, when I've used a type of dosing pump, I have taken a small little, actually did it on the 220 gallon, a very small pump, and put it just below where the dosing pump would dump the alkalinity and calcium, and having it blowing right at it. So as soon as that stuff hit the water, it was getting mixed very, very thoroughly. You can see it kind of clouding up a little bit in that first section, but as soon as it hits that fast moving water, it kind of dissipates. And it's probably a little bit more than I want to add at one time. We got about 10 milliliters left. I'm sure there wouldn't be anything wrong with me just taking it and feeding it to it, but for some reason I just can't bring myself to it. Alright, so now that this is empty, I'm going to give this a good wash. I don't want it to get stained up, like you can kind of see right there already. But essentially, that's how I go about hand dosing. And, you know, you can achieve a solid reef tank with hand dosing. There's a lot of guys out there that have been doing it for a number of years. You don't need to have the latest and greatest equipment to have the latest and greatest reef tank. But ultimately, as far as testing and...
All right, so I'm just going to recap there. Ultimately, I like what I said there at the end, and I have not changed a whole lot as far as the way in which I add calcium and alkalinity products to the system. Big thing that you want to talk about in that circumstance is chemical interference. You want to make sure that you're not putting them in the system at the same time. That's where a dosing pump can be, you know, clutch, where it's going to decide, or you can discern that it's going to dose alkalinity at night and calcium during the day. If you want to, you know, go that route as far as like taking the edge off your pH and you're not having those huge swings. But if you're in a situation like this where you're hand dosing, you can kind of achieve the same thing. You can, you know, during the day, dose your calcium, and then, you know, in the evening when the lights turn out, hit it with your alkalinity. I have kind of gravitated towards using IV bags. You can get those on Amazon and, you know, any medical supply website on the internet. And I use an IV bag. I fill it up because at the amount of adjustments that I have to make here at the store are usually a little bit larger. If it's under 100 mils, I usually hand dose it like you see there. I typically will pour it into the overflow, and as it passes through the plumbing and then gets into that chamber there, it's really well mixed up, and you don't have to worry about it clumping up in your sump. And then if I use the IV bags, I usually drip it. It's like drip acclimation. I drip it into the return pump, and then it goes up into the display from there, and you don't usually have any issues with that, or I haven't seen any issues with it. But hand dosing, usually if it's under 100 mil correction, if it's over 100 mil correction, then I use the IV bag. But really, the two videos that we just took a look at, I thought, you know, that I'd probably have a little bit more arguing with myself, which would have been probably a little bit more entertaining. But I was on the right track as far as, you know, figuring out, for the most part, outside of like what I wanted to maintain, you know, for alkalinity or calcium levels. You know, I really shoot for a number at this point in time, as opposed, you know, shooting for a range. And I think that that's probably the biggest thing that I'd say that has changed. Obviously, if you're still here with me 53 minutes into this, that has probably changed the most, where I was like, yeah, you know, we're kind of in that ballpark area where I want to be. And now I'm like, I shoot for 8 DKH. I'm okay if it's a little bit higher or a little bit. I really am not okay with it being lower than 8. And then the calcium, you know, I'm shooting for 420. If it's a little bit under 420 or if it's a little bit over 420, I'm usually happy with that. But ultimately, you know, I was on the right path with both these videos. So let's jump into some of the products that I use currently to dose my systems here at the store, and also I'd probably would use as a hobbyist as well. But right now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about some of the products that I use to dose calcium and alkalinity to my system. And those two products are Fusion, made by C Chem, Fusion 1 and 2, and then the other two products are ME Coral, Calcium, and Alkalinity. And you might be asking yourself, why are you using two different products? Well, ultimately, the Coral, or the ME Coral product line, is a pharmaceutical grade calcium and alkalinity. And that's all those packages have. So if it says alkalinity on it, that's all you're putting into the system. That is very similar to the Fusion 2 with the ME Coral alkalinity, but that is not similar with the ME Coral calcium and the Fusion 1, which is also a calcium product. In a situation where I am dosing and I have low magnesium in the system as well, which if you have a issue with maintaining proper levels of calcium, you may want to take a look at your magnesium levels, because magnesium tends to keep calcium in line. So if you're battling that, make sure you're testing for that as well. But in a situation where my magnesium levels are where they are and I want to keep them that way, I'm going to use the ME Coral products, specifically the calcium, because there's just calcium in there, and that's all there is. The alkalinity, between the two product lines are pretty similar. The Fusion 2 is a bicarbonate and carbonate alkalinity product, so it may not act the same way as the ME Coral alkalinity. So you want to be careful when you're dosing those and making sure that you're not dosing the Fusion 2 the same way that you're dosing the ME Coral alkalinity. But both these products come in liquid form. So if you're a reefer that doesn't have a ton of time or experience with dosing, I probably would start with the pre-mixed formulas so that you have a baseline, you're working with a consistent product. But if you have a little bit more experience, there is nothing to be said about saving a few bucks and using the ME Coral powder products. You'll probably save money on shipping if you're ordering these items online. And they also, the pouches mix to a gallon, so you want to get yourself a gallon jug. I usually go to Walmart and I go in the home goods section. They have like these jugs that are, I think they have the half gallon as well as the 1 gallon. And what I usually will do is I'll take one of these pouches, I'll fill it up with DI water, RO water. Halfway, I'll put in one pouch, I'll shake it up. There's going to be a chemical reaction and it's going to heat up. And then I will, once I've mixed it for probably about a minute, I will top it off the rest of the way with the RO, and you will notice it cool down rather quickly. You could do it with a water jug just the same. And if you're in a situation where you don't have access to RO DI water, distilled water will work just the same. But if you are going to the grocery store and buying a gallon of water, you might have to take half that water out of there so you can get the powder in, and then go and top that water back off into that jug. Mix it up. Make sure you label it so that you know which is which, because you don't want to be dosing calcium when you're dosing alkalinity. But both these products are very helpful. The Fusion 1, which is the C Chem calcium product, when I have low magnesium, I'm going to use that product as well. And the reason being is it has magnesium in there and some other trace elements. A little bit of a secret sauce recipe. There's also rubidium that's in that product, and rubidium has been known to accelerate torch, zoanthid, and mushroom growth. So if you're looking to get a little bit more growth out of your torches, mushrooms, and zoanthids, that might be a product that you want to take a look at. Rubidium is found in natural seawater, but it is often not put into the salt mixes because it's a relatively expensive element. So ultimately, you can find a little bit more success in those products, or success with that product with those types of corals. So if I have a magnesium issue, I'm using the Fusion 1 calcium. If I am trying to keep my magnesium where it's at, I'm using the ME Coral product line. And for me, to save a couple bucks, I am going to use the powder, just because I'm dosing a lot and I'm trying to save a few bucks here when I can. But both these products are exceptional. I love them. They have served me pretty well, but you will have to change your dosage depending on which one you're using. The BRS calculators tend to not work with the Fusion 1 and 2 because there's some different proprietary mixes going on in those products. You might find that you get there a little bit quicker than you anticipate, so you want to make sure that you're cutting back on your dosage. But the ME Coral products definitely work with the BRS calculators. So ultimately, these two products or these two product lines are going to give you exactly what you're looking for and cover most of your bases as far as when it comes to dosing, alkalinity, and calcium. So if you find yourself in need of any of these products, there's going to be links in the description below, which will bring you to Corals Unlimited. I'm going to put a whole page together that's going to put some of the products that we talked about in this video, as well as some others that I think that will be beneficial to helping you maintain your calcium and alkalinity in your own reef tank.